Before Commodore sold computers, before it sold calculators, and before the Commodore 64 became one of the best-selling computers in history, there was Jack Tramiel. Tramiel was born Idek Tramiel in Łódź, Poland in 1928. Polish people, please correct me on my pronunciation. His early life was shaped by events far removed from the world of consumer electronics. During the Second World War, he and his family were confined to the Łódź ghetto before being deported to Auschwitz. His father didn't survive the war. Tramiel survived Auschwitz and later Arlem, a subcamp of Neuengamme. Many years later, people who worked with Tramiel described him as demanding, fiercely competitive, and intensely focused. And it's sometimes speculated those qualities come from the circumstances that shaped his early life, but who can really know for sure? What's solid is that he lived through trauma that threatened survival itself. Not business survival, just to continue breathing, which must shape perspective. After the war, Tramiel emigrated to the United States and served in the US Army. While stationed there, he learned to repair office equipment, including typewriters. It was practical work and provided skills that proved to be continuously valuable. In 1954, Tramiel founded a company in the Bronx, New York, dedicated to repairing and selling typewriters. He named it Commodore. The exact origin of the name has been explained in different ways over the years. One common account suggests Tramiel wanted a military-sounding title that was easy to remember and available for use as a company name, and Commodore fit the requirement. The business initially focused on typewriters and office machines. During the 1950s and early 1960s, this was a sensible market. Offices depended on such equipment, and demand remained strong. Commodore gradually expanded its operations and developed relationships with manufacturers, particularly in Europe. The company's growth wasn't always smooth. Like many businesses, it encountered financial difficulties and changing market conditions. Yet Commodore survived, and Tramiel repeatedly searched for new opportunities that might allow the company to expand. One of those opportunities appeared in electronics. During the 1960s, electronic calculators began replacing mechanical adding machines. The technology was improving rapidly and prices gradually became more attractive. Commodore recognized the potential and entered the calculator market.
Paperwork. Oh, those dollars go. Worse every year. Figuring percentages really gets me. It's the budgets. You know, I chew up more pencils.
Markups, discounts, too much, too much.
There's gotta be an answer.
Introducing the answer. A really small calculator, a really silent electronic, a really fast thinker, one that works anywhere on battery or plug-in, one with all the calculator know-how you'll probably ever need. Introducing the world's smallest electronic calculator from the maker of the world's most complete line, Sharp. Introducing the LC8. World's smallest electronic calculator by Sharp. Price tag to match, $345 complete. LC8, the answer. See ya.
Calculators offered higher growth potential than typewriters, and the market was expanding quickly. Commodore began importing and selling electronic calculators while competing against numerous other companies attempting to establish themselves in the same space. This period established a pattern that would appear repeatedly throughout Commodore's history. The company was rarely content to remain in a single market for long. When technology shifted, Commodore tended to shift with it. The products changed, the underlying approach didn't. By the early 1970s, calculators were becoming increasingly important to the company's future. Commodore still earned much of its revenue from office equipment, but electronics were beginning to drive the business. And that shift would eventually place the company on a collision course with larger technology firms and expose weaknesses in Commodore's business model. It would also push the company toward a decision that changed everything, the decision to make its own technology rather than depend on somebody else's. The calculator business had opened new possibilities. The next challenge would reveal new vulnerabilities. By the early 1970s, calculators looked like one of the most promising businesses in technology. Not so impressive these days, but that's the nature of the passage of time. For decades, calculations in offices, shops, and schools had relied on mechanical devices. Electronic calculators offered something faster, quieter, and increasingly affordable. Demand grew rapidly, and companies throughout the industry rushed to participate, and Commodore was one of them. The company expanded aggressively into calculators, importing components, assembling products, and competing in a market that seemed capable of supporting enormous growth. For a time, the strategy worked. Sales increased, new models appeared. Commodore strengthened its position and looked poised to benefit from the growing popularity of the electronic devices. To many observers, calculators appeared to be the future. The problem was that attractive markets tend to attract competitors. As more companies entered the industry, prices began to fall. Improvements in semiconductor manufacturing reduced costs, allowing calculators that had once been expensive business tools to become increasingly accessible consumer products. What had looked like a golden opportunity gradually became a battleground. While companies such as Commodore fought over calculators, other engineers and programmers were beginning to experiment with entirely different uses for computers. Most people still associated computing with businesses, universities, and government institutions, but small groups of enthusiasts were discovering that computers could also entertain. One example was Hunt the Wumpus, a text-based game created by Gregory Yob in 1973. Players explored a cave system while attempting to avoid hazards and track down the creature, giving the game its name. By modern standards, it's simple, of course, but it demonstrated something important. Computers could be used for play as well as work. Commodore had no involvement with games at this stage, yet developments such as Hunt the Wumpus hinted at possibilities that extended far beyond calculators. A growing number of people were beginning to view computers as flexible machines capable of many different tasks. And that idea would eventually become central to Commodore's future, even if the company didn't realize it just yet. Commodore was in the calculator game. The company soon discovered that it faced a significant disadvantage. It sold calculators, but it didn't manufacture chips that made them work. Those components came from suppliers, and as long as suppliers remained neutral, the arrangement was manageable. Commodore could purchase parts, build products, and compete alongside other manufacturers. The situation became much more complicated when suppliers decided they wanted a larger share of the market for themselves. The most important example was Texas Instruments, and Texas Instruments occupied a powerful position within the industry.
There's a better way for everyone. Calculators with Texas Instruments quality. The TI-1200, basic economy, but with extras, a percent key and automatic constant. An economical TI-1250 with memory. From the company that invented the integrated circuit and made miniature calculators possible. Texas Instruments, the better way keeps getting better.
The company manufactured semiconductor components and supplied chips to calculator makers around the world. At first, that relationship appeared beneficial. Companies such as Commodore gained access to the technology they needed, while Texas Instruments gained customers. Then Texas Instruments began selling calculators directly. The move transformed a supplier into a competitor. Suddenly, companies purchasing chips from Texas Instruments found themselves competing against products produced by the same organization supplying their components. Texas Instruments could influence costs, production, and pricing in ways that many competitors couldn't match. The consequences spread throughout the industry. Prices fell rapidly, profit margins shrank. Some companies struggled to survive. Others disappeared entirely. Manufacturers that lacked control over the supply chains found themselves particularly vulnerable, and Commodore felt the pressure. The company had entered the calculator market hoping to build a stronger future. Instead, it found itself trapped inside a fierce price war where competitors possessed significant advantages. Products that seemed profitable one year became difficult to sell the next. The market continued growing, but participating in it became increasingly difficult. And for Jack Tramiel, the experience reinforced a lesson that would influence Commodore for years to come. Dependence can be dangerous. If another company controlled essential components, Commodore's future could be affected by decisions made elsewhere. A supplier could change prices, a competitor could gain advantages, entire markets could shift unexpectedly. The obvious solution was greater control. The challenge was figuring out how to achieve it. Throughout the calculator crisis, Commodore searched for a more secure position. The company needed access to technology rather than simple dependence upon it. Owning products was no longer enough. Increasingly, success seemed to depend on owning the components inside those products as well. The calculator industry had revealed how quickly technology markets could change. Companies that appeared secure could suddenly find themselves exposed. Commodore needed a different approach if it wanted to avoid repeating the experience. The search for that approach would eventually lead the company towards semiconductors, and at first glance, the decision made perfect sense. If suppliers represented a problem, owning a supplier might provide a solution. Yet the acquisition Commodore eventually pursued would bring far more than manufacturing capability. It would bring engineers, microprocessors, and it would bring one of the most influential figures in Commodore's history. The future of Commodore wouldn't be found in calculators, it would be found inside a small company called MOS Technology. One of the most important people inside MOS Technology was Chuck Peddle. Peddle had worked on Motorola's 6800 microprocessor project, but he believed computers could become dramatically cheaper than many people in the industry expected. Peddle saw a larger potential market. If processors could be made affordable enough, entirely new groups of people might be able to own computers, but Motorola disagreed. After disputes over pricing and direction, Peddle left the company along with several colleagues and joined MOS Technology. The move gave him an opportunity to pursue ideas that had attracted little enthusiasm at his previous employer. And one of the results was the 6502 microprocessor. When the 6502 was introduced in 1975, its price attracted immediate attention. Competing processors often cost many times more. The 6502 launched at around $25, a figure so low that some observers reportedly assumed there'd been a mistake. Yet the chip was real, and its affordability immediately made it attractive to engineers, hobbyists, and small companies. The processor would eventually power some of the most important machines in computing history. At the time, however, it was simply a remarkably inexpensive chip searching for customers. MOS soon recognized that potential users needed a practical way to experiment with the technology. In 1976, the company introduced the KIM-1. The machine was never intended to become a mass-market computer. It was designed as a demonstration and development system that would allow engineers to explore what the 6502 could do. The KIM-1 consisted primarily of a circuit board, keypad, and display. It looked more like a piece of laboratory equipment than a consumer product. Yet something unexpected happened. Hobbyists embraced it. Users expanded their systems, shared modifications, and exchanged software through magazines and computer clubs. What MOS had created as a development platform was gradually becoming part of a small but growing computer culture. This is where games enter Commodore's story for the first time. One of the most notable pieces of software created for the KIM-1 was Microchess by Peter Jennings. Released in 1976, it's often cited as one of the earliest commercially sold microcomputer games. Owners could purchase a chess program for their home computer at a time when personal computing itself remained a niche hobby. Other users experimented with tiny basic mathematical software and custom programs of their own. The KAM-1 remained a niche product, but it revealed something important about personal computing. Owners wanted things to do with their machines. Hardware attracted attention. Software kept people interested. And while hobbyists explored the KAM-1, MOS Technology faced challenges of its own. Growth required resources. Competition remained intense. Opportunities existed, but so did risks. In 1976, Commodore acquired MOS Technology. On paper, the transaction appeared straightforward. Commodore gained semiconductor manufacturing capability and greater control over its supply chain. In reality, Commodore had acquired much more than a chip company. It gained the 6502 processor, it gained the engineers responsible for creating it, and it gained experience from the KIM-1 project. Also Chuck Peddle. Peddle soon became one of the most influential voices inside Commodore. He believed calculators represented a limited future compared with the opportunities emerging in personal computing. The KAM-1 had already demonstrated that enthusiasts wanted affordable computers. Software such as microchess showed that owners wanted more than calculators or electronic tools. The challenge was convincing Commodore to think bigger.
Good morning.
Good morning.
You come into your office, grab a cup of coffee,
Morning, Fred.
and a Xerox machine presents your morning mail on a screen.
What's the mail this morning? This one looks interesting. Let's take a look at this. I'm going to need a couple of copies of this.
Push a button, and the words and images you see on the screen appear on paper.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Fred. You know, Fred, I think everybody on the routing list should see this.
Push another button, and the information is sent electronically to similar units around the corner or around the world. This is an experimental office system. It's in use now at the Xerox Research Center in Palo Alto, California. Soon, Xerox systems like this will help you manage your most precious resource, information.
Anything else? Flowers. Well, what flowers? My anniversary. I forgot.
For Jack Tramiel, the acquisition had begun as a practical solution to a manufacturing problem. What he received was a glimpse of an entirely new industry. Commodore had entered the deal looking for chips, and it emerged with the foundations of a computer company. The next step was turning those foundations into a product that ordinary people could buy. That product would become the PET. By the beginning of 1977, Commodore had committed itself to a new direction. The company still sold calculators, typewriters, and office equipment, but Chuck Peddle and the former MOS team were now pushing Commodore toward personal computing. The acquisition of MOS Technology had provided the components, engineers, and expertise necessary to build a computer. What Commodore needed next was an actual product. According to later accounts, Jack Tramiel gave Peddle a demanding deadline. Commodore wanted a machine ready for the Winter Consumer Electronics Show in January 1977. The company had spent years competing in crowded consumer markets, and Tramiel had little interest in waiting for the perfect product. If computers represented the future, Commodore intended to enter the market quickly. The resulting machine became known as the PT or PET. The name would later be expanded into Personal Electronic Transactor, although stories from inside Commodore suggest that the popular PET rock craze may also have influenced the choice. Whatever the origin, the machine represented something much more significant than a new product line. It was Commodore's first computer. Unlike many systems available at the time, the PET was designed as a complete package. Instead of purchasing separate components and assembling them into a working system, customers received a computer, monitor, and keyboard in a single unit. For people encountering personal computers for the first time, that was pretty cool. The machine looked finished. That may sound like a small detail today, but many early computers expected owners to perform a surprising amount of work themselves. Some required assembly, others required separate monitors or storage devices, but the PET moved personal computing closer to an appliance than a hobbyist project. Commodore publicly demonstrated a prototype at the Winter Consumer Electronics Show in January 1977. A few months later, the machine appeared again at the first West Coast Computer Fair in San Francisco. Thousands of attendees filled the venue with new hardware, software, and demonstrations. Commodore's PETs appeared alongside machines from other companies attempting to define what personal computing would become. For Commodore, the important point was not who else attended, it was that the company belonged there at all. Only a few years earlier, Commodore had been known primarily for calculators and office equipment. Now it was presenting a personal computer to developers, retailers, educators, and other prospective customers. The PET also benefited from something that helped distinguish personal computers from calculators: software. Built into the machine was Microsoft Basic. Instead of loading programming tools from external media, owners could switch on the computer and begin typing commands almost immediately. For newcomers, Basic provided an accessible introduction to computing, and for experienced users, it offered a platform for creating their own programs. Computer magazines quickly filled with software listings that readers could type into their machines themselves. Some programs were practical, others were educational. Many existed simply because people enjoyed experimenting with what these new machines could do, and games appeared almost immediately. 70s, computers, I don't want to typecast, but one of the most popular categories involved adaptations of Star Trek. Why not? Variations of the game had already circulated on large computer systems for years, and PET owners soon created their own versions. Players explored sectors of space, hunted Klingon ships, and managed limited resources through text commands and simple graphics. The appeal wasn't visual spectacle, the appeal was ownership. For many users, this was the first time they'd been able to run a game on a computer sitting in their own home, rather than a machine owned by a university or large institution. Lunar Lander became another common sight on early systems. In it, players attempted to guide spacecraft safely to the surface of a planet using carefully controlled bursts of thrust, and like Star Trek, the game appeared in numerous variations and helped demonstrate how a computer could become a source of entertainment as well as education. Only a few years earlier, Commodore had been selling computers designed to perform specific tasks. Now, customers were purchasing machines capable of running an endless variety of programs. The value no longer resided entirely in the hardware, it increasingly depended on what owners chose to do with it. Schools soon noticed the potential. The PET's integrated design made it attractive to educational institutions. Teachers didn't need to assemble complicated systems or explain multiple pieces of hardware to students. The machine arrived as a complete package and included a programming language ready to use from the moment it was switched on. For many users, the PET became their first direct experience with computing. They learned BASIC, experimented with educational software, and, when teachers were not looking too closely, often found time for games as well. Long before the Commodore 64 appeared in bedrooms and living rooms, Commodore computers were already appearing in classrooms. The education market also provided something Commodore needed: stability. Home computing remained unpredictable. Nobody knew how large the market would become or which companies would survive. Schools purchased machines in groups and often kept them in service for years. Every classroom installation exposed more students to Commodore hardware and introduced more people to personal computing. Demand for the PET steadily increased, and that growth created its own problems. Commodore struggled to keep pace with orders, and customers often faced lengthy waits before receiving their machines. The delays frustrated buyers, but they also demonstrated something that hadn't been obvious only a few years earlier. People wanted personal computers. The market remained small compared with later decades, but it was growing rapidly. The idea of owning a computer was gradually becoming less unusual. The PET was not the most powerful machine available, it wasn't even the cheapest. It wasn't the final word in computer design. What it did provide was proof. Commodore could build computers. Customers would buy them.
Letters from the alphabet. Perhaps the most advanced concept at the show, however, are computer kits that can be made by amateurs for use in the home. The South Florida Computer Group has 40 members who've spent an average of $1,500 on their gear.
The average person can use it for burglar alarm control. They could use it to control their heater at home or their air conditioning in order to get the maximum use out of every dollar spent in electricity, let's say. The housewife, for example, could use the computer with a little program that she writes to take recipes and change the proportions around in order to feed different people.
The home computer can also be programmed for games such as Star Trek, which even
and the audience extended far beyond engineers and hobbyists. The company that entered the decade selling calculators was steadily becoming something else. The PET had shown that people would buy personal computers, and by the end of the 70s, the more important question was how many people might buy them. Schools were purchasing PET systems, businesses were experimenting with software, hobbyists were filling magazines with programs, modifications, and technical discussions. Personal computing had established a foothold, but it remained a niche activity. For a company with Jack Tramiel's ambitions, niche markets were not especially attractive. Throughout Commodore's history, Tramiel had pursued volume. The company had built typewriters, calculators, and office equipment for large audiences rather than specialist groups. Personal computers, however, remained expensive purchases. Most people had never used one, many had never even seen one. The challenge was no longer building a computer, Commodore had already done that. The challenge was persuading ordinary people that they wanted one. By the end of the decade, computer shops could still feel intimidating places. Machines sat beside technical manuals and memory expansions. Sales staff discussed processors, storage devices, and programming languages. Enthusiasts understood the appeal immediately, but most other people didn't. A parent walking into a computer shop often faced an obvious question: what exactly would this machine do for my family? And the answer wasn't always clear to them. Some owners learned BASIC and wrote programs of their own. Others balanced accounts, stored records, or experimented with educational software. Students typed programs from magazines line by line, hoping they hadn't made a mistake somewhere in the process. Games helped. A bookkeeping program required explanation, a game usually didn't. A visitor might walk past a demonstration computer without paying much attention to a spreadsheet. That same person could stop and watch a game for several minutes. And retailers noticed the difference, software publishers noticed the difference, and computer manufacturers noticed the difference. Simple games were easy to understand, even for people with no interest in programming. The objective could often be grasped within seconds, and more importantly, it often didn't need to be explained at all. Games were becoming one of the easiest ways to demonstrate why somebody might care about a computer in the first place. At the same time, software companies were beginning to emerge around the growing market. Every new computer owner increased the audience for software. And every new piece of software gave people another reason to purchase a computer. One of the people thinking deeply about these problems was Michael Tomczyk.
Said, he should be working for me. And I just kept saying, no, get lost. batting them away constantly. I wanted to call the new computer the Commodore Spirit because we already had the PET, and we had a business computer called the CBM, which was like a PET for business people. I wanted to call it the Commodore Spirit. But at the last minute, we're ready to put the name on the computer, the Japanese sent me a note and said, "Can't call it the Commodore Spirit." And I said, "Why?" And they said, "Because spirit doesn't mean friendly ghost like in America. It means horrible, ghoulish, soul-eating monster from hell. So you can't call it the Commodore Spirit."
Magazines carried reviews, advertisements, and program listings. User groups exchanged discs and cassette tapes. Educational programs, utilities, and games all competed for attention. Tomczyk had joined Commodore and became increasingly involved in discussions about the future of personal computing. His focus was less on existing enthusiasts than in people who had never considered purchasing a computer at all. That was a very different audience. Families shopping in department stores, students encountering technology for the first time, parents who wanted something useful, educational, or entertaining for the home. And that focus played directly to Commodore's strengths. Unlike many competitors, the company already understood mass market retail. It had spent years manufacturing consumer products and placing them in front of ordinary shoppers. The challenge was no longer building a computer, it was presenting one in a way that made sense to people who'd never owned one. The question was what kind of computer those customers would actually buy. Part of the answer emerged from work being carried out inside Commodore itself. Engineer Al Charpentier had been developing a video chip that offered a different path forward. Instead of creating another machine aimed primarily at businesses and enthusiasts, Commodore could build a color computer intended for a much broader audience. Color was easy to understand. Customers didn't need a technical explanation. They could see it immediately. The same was true of a colorful game running on a television screen. People might disagree about processor specifications or memory configurations. They rarely needed help recognizing an attractive display or an entertaining game. By the end of the 70s, Commodore had learned several important lessons. Schools, businesses, hobbyists, they'd all buy computers. The much larger opportunity lay elsewhere. Millions of people had never owned a computer, never attended a computer club, and never typed a line of BASIC. Commodore no longer needed a better computer, it needed a computer for people who had never considered buying one. That machine would become the VIC-20. Commodore had spent the late 1970s trying to answer a difficult question. How do you convince ordinary people that they might want a computer? The company's answer began in Japan. In 1980, Commodore introduced a new machine called the VIC-1001. The following year, it reached international markets as the VIC-20. Although the name changed, the goal remained the same. Commodore was no longer trying to prove that personal computers were possible. The company was trying to prove they could become ordinary. The PET had established Commodore's position within the computer industry, but it remained associated with schools, businesses, and enthusiasts. The VIC-20 targeted a different audience. It was designed to be less intimidating, less expensive, and easier to introduce to people who'd never owned a computer before. In many ways, the machine represented ideas that had been developing inside Commodore throughout the late 1970s. It used the MOS Technology 6502 processor that had entered the company through the acquisition of MOS. It incorporated video technology developed by Al Charpentier. It reflected Michael Tomczyk's belief that computers needed to reach beyond traditional hobbyist audiences. Most importantly, it aligned perfectly with Jack Tramel's long-standing focus on affordability and volume. The VIC-20's hardware reflected those priorities. It connected to an ordinary television rather than requiring a dedicated monitor. It displayed color graphics. It supported cartridges that allowed software to load quickly and easily. Owners could still learn programming through BASIC, but they no longer needed to begin their computing experience by typing lengthy listings from magazines. Cartridges proved particularly useful for games. Instead of spending an evening entering code from a magazine, a customer could insert a cartridge and begin playing within moments. Titles such as Jupiter Lander helped introduce new owners to the machine. Inspired by the same basic concept as Lunar Lander, the game challenged players to guide a spacecraft safely to the surface while managing fuel and momentum. It was simple, accessible, and easy to understand, making it exactly the sort of software that suited Commodore's new audience. Other games demonstrated different possibilities. Radar Rat Race, released by Commodore in 1981, took inspiration from the maze games becoming popular in arcades. Players guided a rat through increasingly difficult stages while avoiding enemies and hazards. The game was straightforward, colourful, and immediately understandable, making it useful both as entertainment and as a demonstration of what the machine could do. That goal influenced how Commodore presented the VIC-20 to the public. The company didn't rely solely on specialist computer magazines. Instead, it pursued a broader audience using techniques that would have seemed unusual only a few years earlier. Commodore sought distribution channels capable of reaching ordinary consumers, rather than just dedicated computer users. One of the clearest examples was Kmart. The VIC-20 became the first computer sold through the retail chain. Customers no longer needed to visit specialist electronics shops to encounter a personal computer. They could see one while shopping for household goods, clothing, or toys. Commodore reinforced that strategy through advertising. The company recruited Star Trek's own William Shatner as a spokesperson, a decision that revealed exactly who it hoped to reach. Shatner wasn't a programmer or a technology journalist. He was a familiar television personality recognized by millions of potential customers. The advertisements were designed to make computers feel approachable. Instead of asking consumers to join a technical hobby, Commodore presented computing as something ordinary people could understand and enjoy. And the strategy worked. The VIC-20 became the first computer to sell more than 1 million units. That achievement is easy to overlook today because later machines sold in much greater numbers. At the time, however, it represented a major milestone. Commodore had demonstrated that a computer could move beyond hobbyists and businesses and become a genuine consumer product.
Why buy just a video game from Atari or Intel? Invest in the wonder computer of the 1980s for under $300, the Commodore VIC-20. Unlike games, it has a real computer keyboard. With the Commodore VIC-20, the whole family can learn computing at home. Plays great games, too. Under $300, the wonder computer of the 1980s, the Commodore VIC-20.
Coming soon, Commodore brings you Gorf, the Wonder arcade game, and Omega Race in home versions. Commodore.
Games played an important role in that transformation. Arcade conversions became increasingly important. Games such as Omega Race and Gorf brought recognizable arcade experiences into the home. For many players, this was the closest they could come to owning an arcade machine themselves. The appeal was obvious. Instead of spending coins at a local arcade, owners could play similar experiences on a machine connected to the family television. The games also served another purpose. They demonstrated the machine to prospective customers. A retailer could show Jupiter Lander, Radar Rat Race, Gorf, or Omega Race to a passing shopper and receive an immediate reaction. Potential buyers didn't need a lengthy explanation of programming languages or business software, they simply needed to watch. As more VIC-20 systems entered homes, software publishers took notice, developers saw a growing audience, new companies appeared, existing companies expanded their efforts. Yet success created a new challenge. The VIC-20 proved that mass-market computing was possible. It also revealed how quickly the market was expanding. Customers wanted better graphics, more memory, and more sophisticated software. Developers wanted additional capabilities. Competitors were introducing new machines and chasing the same opportunity. The next stage of Commodore's history would not be about proving that people wanted home computers, it would be about dominating the market that had emerged around them, and that effort would produce the most successful computer in the company's history, the Commodore 64. When the Commodore 64 launched in 1982, Commodore was already one of the most successful companies in home computing. The VIC-20 had proved that computers could reach a mass audience. Millions of people had encountered personal computing through Commodore hardware. Retailers understood the market, software publishers recognized the opportunity, and the industry was growing rapidly. Commodore intended to grow with it. The new machine took its name from one of its most heavily advertised features, 64 kilobytes of memory. Wow. At a time when memory remained expensive, the figure attracted attention. Yet the Commodore 64's success would ultimately depend on much more than a number printed on the box. The machine combined several advantages. It offered substantial memory, capable graphics, and a competitive price. Commodore's control over manufacturing allowed the company to reduce costs in ways that many competitors struggled to match. The result was a machine that appealed to a remarkably broad audience. For many owners, however, the most memorable experiences came from the games. One of the machine's defining strengths was its sound hardware. The SID chip, designed by Bob Yanis, provided capabilities that stood out immediately. Music became richer, sound effects became more distinctive, developers could create audio that felt dramatically more sophisticated than many players expected from a home computer. The impact became clear as software libraries expanded. A generation of composers began producing music specifically for the machine. Players who might not have remembered every detail of a game often remembered its soundtrack. The Commodore 64 helped establish the idea that game music could become a major part of the experience rather than a simple accompaniment.
IBM calls this a personal computer and says a person can afford it, yet it's over $1,500. Apple says computing is a revolution that can't be missed, but at $1,530 you could miss it. Atari says computers are now within reach. Well, the Commodore 64 has more built-in memory than the others, and it's under $600. So, while everyone else talks about the revolution that's coming, you can experience the revolution that's here.
The machine's graphics encouraged similar experimentation. Developers constantly reached for new ways to push the hardware beyond its apparent limits. Programmers discovered techniques that allowed games to look and perform better than many people thought possible on the system. The machine's capabilities continued expanding as developers learned how to extract more from the hardware. Some of the most influential games arrived surprisingly early. Epix became one of the companies most closely associated with the platform. In 1984, it released Summer Games, a collection of Olympic-style events that showcased colorful graphics, multiplayer competition, and accessible gameplay. The game became a popular demonstration title because it was easy to understand and enjoyable to watch. People gathered around it, friends competed, families took turns attempting to beat one another's scores. The computer became a social object rather than a solitary one. Games weren't simply software products, they often became reasons for people to spend time together. Other developers pushed in different directions. Impossible Mission, released by Epix in the same year, combined platforming, puzzle solving, and unusually expressive animation. The game's digitized speech immediately attracted attention. Hearing a computer announce, "Stay a while, stay forever," felt startling to many players encountering it for the first time. The achievement was not merely technical, it was memorable. The game demonstrated how personality and presentation could help software stand out in an increasingly crowded market. By 1984, Commodore owners were also beginning to hear about an unusual game called Elite. Created by David Braben and Ian Bell for the BBC Micro, the game offered trading, combat, and exploration inside a vast, generated galaxy. Reviews attracted attention, magazines discussed its technical achievements, word spread through schools, computer clubs, and playground conversations. Commodore 64 owners wouldn't have to wait much longer. The growing excitement surrounding it hinted at where computer games might be heading next. The growth of software was accompanied by the growth of culture. Magazines expanded in size and influence. Readers debated reviews, exchanged tips, and eagerly anticipated upcoming releases. Publications devoted to the Commodore 64 became fixtures of everyday life for many owners. Some readers purchased magazines primarily for information, others purchased them for the cassette tapes, discs, or type-in programs included with them, and many did both. Owning a Commodore 64 increasingly meant belonging to a wider culture. Players copied discs, swapped recommendations, and discussed new releases at school, at work, and in computer clubs. Developers became recognizable figures. Publishers built reputations. The ecosystem surrounding the machine grew larger with each passing year. The Commodore 64 eventually became the best-selling single model of personal computer in history. Millions of people learned programming, played games, created music, experimented with graphics, or experienced personal computing for the first time on a Commodore 64. The machine was no longer simply a product, it had become an environment, and Commodore stood near the center of one of the fastest growing industries in the world. The challenge now was maintaining that position as competitors fought for the same customers. The home computer wars were about to intensify. By the mid-1980s, home computing was no longer a curiosity, it was a major business. Manufacturers competed for shelf space, software publishers fought for attention, retailers filled displays with computers, peripherals, and games. New customers continued entering the market while existing owners demanded increasingly sophisticated hardware and software. For Commodore, this should have been a comfortable position. The company possessed the best-selling computer in the world, yet success attracted competition. Every manufacturer wanted a share of the growing market, and many believed they could challenge Commodore's position. The result was an increasingly aggressive struggle over prices, distribution, and market share. Jack Tramiel had spent years competing fiercely in calculators and computers. The broader industry was now learning the same lesson. Price could determine survival. Commodore possessed advantages that many competitors lacked. The acquisition of MOS Technology had given the company significant control over manufacturing. It could also produce key components internally and reduce costs in ways that rivals often struggled to match. As Commodore lowered prices, pressure spread throughout the market. Some companies adapted, others didn't. One of the most striking examples involved our friends Texas Instruments again. Earlier in Commodore's history, Texas Instruments had contributed to the calculator crisis by competing against companies that relied on its components. Now the situation had reversed. Competition intensified, margins shrank, and Texas Instruments eventually withdrew from the home computer market altogether. The irony was difficult to miss. A company that had once helped create Commodore's problems had become one of the casualties of the industry's changing economics.
Looking for a powerful home computer? This is the one. Texas Instruments home computer. With 16K memory, it can take you a long way. Want a computer with a lot of software? Oh, yeah, this is the one. The TI home computer gives you more of these software cartridges than any computer in the world. The whole world. So, with all the power you have here to run all the power here, this is the one. The home computer from Texas Instruments. This is the one.
While manufacturers fought over hardware, software publishers experienced a different reality. The audience for games was growing rapidly. Every new Commodore 64 created another potential customer. Every successful game encouraged more people to consider purchasing a computer. Hardware and software increasingly depended upon one another. Some of the most memorable Commodore 64 games emerged during this period. Epyx followed summer games with winter games in 1985. The title transformed sporting events into colourful competitions that worked particularly well in groups. Friends challenged one another, compared scores and argued over results. Like its predecessor, the game helped demonstrate that home computers could become shared entertainment rather than solitary hobbies. At the same time, Commodore owners finally gained access to Elite. Players had been hearing about the game since its 1984 debut on the BBC Micro. Created by David Braben and Ian Bell, it offered something that sounded almost impossible on an 8-bit home computer, a vast galaxy containing hundreds of star systems, trading, combat, piracy, bounty hunting, and exploration. The Commodore 64 version arrived in 1985. Players began with a modest ship, limited funds, and no fixed path through the game. They could trade goods, hunt pirates, smuggle contraband, upgrade equipment, or simply explore. Progress depended less on reflexes than judgment. Profitable routes had to be learned, dangerous systems had to be recognized. Every improvement to the ship required time and effort. The game's graphics were simple wireframes, but the simulation behind them felt remarkably convincing. Planets possessed economies, trade routes developed patterns, individual journeys created stories that players shared with friends. Many owners spent weeks or months building their fortunes and improving their ships. Elite suggested that home computers could support experiences far larger and more open-ended than most players had previously imagined. Other developers pursued different forms of ambition. Andrew Braybrook's Paradroid, released in 1985, combined action, strategy, and exploration aboard a spaceship populated by hostile robots. Players could take control of enemy machines through a transfer system that allowed weaker units to seize stronger ones. The concept was unusual, and the execution demonstrated how inventive design could distinguish a game even in an increasingly crowded market. Braybrook followed with Uridium in 1986. Enemy vessels stretched across the screen while players raced along their surfaces at remarkable speed, destroying targets before escaping. The game became one of the clearest examples of what skilled programmers could achieve on Commodore's hardware. Arcade conversions remained important throughout the period. Players still wanted to bring experiences from amusement arcades into their homes, and publishers continued investing heavily in conversions of popular coin-operated games. The demand reflected a broader shift. Home computers were no longer competing with arcades for attention. Increasingly, they were becoming an alternative to them. The software market continued expanding. Publishers appeared and disappeared. Successful developers built loyal followings. New releases arrived constantly. The Commodore 64's enormous user base encouraged companies to invest heavily in software, knowing that a successful game could reach a substantial audience. And for a time, the arrangement seemed extraordinarily successful. The Commodore 64 sat at the center of a growing ecosystem of manufacturers, publishers, retailers, and players. More users attracted more software attracted more users. Yet markets rarely remained stable for long. Even as the Commodore 64 continued thriving, developers wanted more colors, better sound, and increasingly sophisticated software. The next generation of hardware was already beginning to emerge. Inside Commodore, another change was approaching, and this one wouldn't be caused by a competitor, it would come from within the company itself. For much of Commodore's history, Jack Tramiel had been the company's driving force. He had overseen its transformation from a typewriter business into one of the most successful computer manufacturers in the world. Commodore survived the calculator wars, acquired MOS Technology, entered personal computing, and built the best-selling computer on the market during his time at the company. As Commodore grew, however, disagreements became harder to avoid. The company that had once been a relatively small operation was now a major international business. New products required new investment. Manufacturing expanded. Different executives held different views about strategy, spending, and the company's future direction. Success didn't eliminate tension, in some ways it increased it. By 1984, conflicts between Tramiel and Commodore's board had become serious enough to threaten the stability of the organization. Accounts differ on the precise details, but the outcome is clear. Jack Tramiel left Commodore. The departure surprised many observers. Founders don't usually leave companies during periods of enormous success, yet the man who had overseen Commodore's rise was suddenly gone.
The decision makers of the future.
So, for Jack Tramiel, the home computer war is the 20th century children's crusade. Just one of many metaphors that can be applied to his zest for business and for life.
When I say first that business is war, people, stare at me. But really what it means, you can turn around and you can say business is like serving breakfast. To me also I use also word sex. To me, business is like sex. I like to touch it. I like to be with it. I don't like to look at it on the screen. I like to be there where the action is.
The news obviously created uncertainty. Investors wondered how the company would adapt. Employees faced a changing leadership structure. Commodore still possessed strong products, manufacturing capabilities, and a large customer base, but an important source of direction had disappeared. Tramiel himself had no intention of retiring. Shortly after leaving Commodore, he acquired Atari's consumer division from Warner Communications and became responsible for one of the most recognizable names in electronic entertainment. The move immediately attracted attention. For years, Commodore and Atari had occupied neighboring parts of the same industry. Now the individual most closely associated with Commodore had become a rival. The situation grew even more remarkable because several former Commodore employees followed him. The rivalry was no longer purely corporate. People who'd worked together were now competing against one another. One result of this was the Atari ST. Introduced in 1985, the machine became one of the most significant competitors to Commodore's future plans. It offered a graphical user interface, strong performance, and competitive price. In several markets, particularly Europe, comparisons between the Atari ST and Commodore's next generation of computers would become a familiar feature of magazine reviews and consumer discussions. For consumers, the rivalry created one of the defining technology contests of the late 1980s. For Commodore, it created a more personal problem. Its founder was now leading a competing company at precisely the moment the industry was preparing for another technological transition. The Commodore 64 remained enormously successful, but few people believed it would dominate forever. Developers wanted better graphics, more memory, and more sophisticated audio capabilities. Customers expected progress. Commodore needed a successor. The company already had engineers exploring future possibilities, but another opportunity was beginning to emerge outside the organization. A small California company was developing a remarkably ambitious computer system. Its creators believed personal computers could become multimedia machines capable of advanced graphics, impressive sound, and sophisticated multitasking. The technology attracted attention because it seemed to offer a glimpse of the future. The company's name was Amiga. For Commodore, the timing could hardly have been more significant. The company had lost its founder. That founder now controlled a rival computer company. The industry was preparing for another technological transition, and one of the most promising technologies in personal computing had suddenly become available. Commodore's next move would shape the rest of its history. While Commodore adjusted to life without Jack Tramiel, a very different story was unfolding in California. A small company called Amiga Corporation was attempting to build what its founders believed would become the next generation of personal computer technology. The project combined ambitious engineering, uncertain finances, and expectations that sometimes seemed years ahead of the wider industry. The origins of the company reflected the experimental atmosphere of the early 1980s. Founded by J. Miner and a team of engineers, Amiga initially explored the possibility of creating advanced gaming hardware. Miner was already highly respected within the industry for his work on Atari systems and believed home electronics could deliver experiences far beyond what contemporary machines were providing. As development continued, the project's ambitions expanded. Rather than creating a games console, the team began designing a complete computer platform. The machine would use custom chips dedicated to graphics, sound, and other specialized tasks. The goal was straightforward: deliver capabilities that existing home computers struggled to match. It was expensive. It was also potentially transformative. Throughout the early 1980s, developers constantly worked around hardware limitations. Memory was restricted, graphics were constrained, audio capabilities often required compromise. The Amiga team wanted to build a machine where those compromises became far less severe. The project eventually became known by the codename Lorraine. Demonstrations generated excitement because they appeared to show capabilities normally associated with much more expensive systems. Smooth animation, advanced graphics, and sophisticated sound all suggested that the machine belonged to a different generation of hardware. But there was one major problem: Amiga Corporation needed money. Developing advanced technology required resources, and resources were becoming increasingly scarce. The company explored partnerships and funding arrangements while attempting to complete the machine. One of those arrangements involved Atari. The agreement provided Amiga with financial support while giving Atari access to technology that could potentially become the foundation of a future computer. At the time, the relationship appeared beneficial to both companies. Then circumstances changed dramatically. Jack Tramiel left Commodore and acquired Atari's consumer division.
Joining us now is Leonard Tramiel. Leonard is Vice President for Software Development at Atari, and next to Leonard, his father, Jack Tramiel. Jack, Chairman and CEO of Atari, and formerly the President of Commodore.
Jack, you were Commodore. You were a very important part of Commodore, obviously, several years ago when the low-cost calculator, 995 calculator, was introduced. What is your idea about marketing low-cost devices?
Well, my idea is always to try to bring the best technology at the lowest price to the masses. We are a company which we like to sell to the masses, not to the classes.
At roughly the same moment, Commodore began looking for a successor to the Commodore 64. Both companies suddenly found themselves interested in the same technology. In 1984, Commodore acquired Amiga Corporation. The purchase instantly transformed the situation. Instead of gaining access to Amiga's technology, Atari found itself watching a major competitor take control of it. Legal disputes followed, accusations were exchanged, and tensions increased. The rivalry between Commodore and Atari was no longer simply a competition between products. It had become a bit personal. For Commodore, however, the acquisition represented an extraordinary opportunity. The company had not purchased a finished product. It had acquired a team of engineers and a machine that many believed represented the future of home computing. Development continued under Commodore ownership, expectations grew, rumors circulated through magazines and industry events. Developers and journalists speculated about what the hardware might eventually achieve. The official unveiling arrived in 1985. The Amiga 1000 immediately distinguished itself from the machines that had established Commodore's reputation. This wasn't an incremental update to the Commodore 64, it was an attempt to redefine expectations of what a personal computer could do. The demonstrations attracted attention because they looked different. Graphics moved smoothly across the screen. Multiple tasks could run simultaneously. Audio capabilities exceeded what many users expected from a home computer. The machine appeared comfortable handling work that often challenged competing systems. Developers recognized the possibilities almost immediately. Games could become larger and more visually ambitious. Musicians gained access to sophisticated audio capabilities, and artists discovered new creative tools. The machine appealed to multiple audiences at once, and that versatility became one of its defining characteristics. Some users viewed the Amiga primarily as a games machine, others saw a creative workstation, others even regarded it as a general-purpose personal computer. Each group would help shape the machine's identity into the years ahead. For the moment, however, the most important fact was simpler. Commodore had acquired one of the most ambitious computer projects of the decade. The company was no longer defending its position with the Commodore 64. It was preparing for the next generation. The question was whether the Amiga could justify the extraordinary expectations surrounding it. When the Amiga 1000 reached consumers in 1985, it entered a market that was changing rapidly. The Commodore 64 remained enormously successful. New IBM-compatible computers continued appearing. Atari was preparing the ST. Developers wanted more powerful hardware. Consumers expected increasingly sophisticated software. In the middle of all this stood the Amiga. The machine immediately attracted attention because it felt different from many of its competitors. Windows moved smoothly, animations appeared fluid, audio sounded unusually rich. For many observers, the machine seemed to offer a glimpse of where personal computing might be heading. Yet, impressive demonstrations only mattered if software followed. Fortunately for Commodore, it did. One of the earliest titles to demonstrate the machine's potential was Defender of the Crown, released by Cinemaware in 1986. Combining strategy, action sequences, and lavish presentation, the game looked dramatically different from many contemporary releases. Large illustrated scenes, detailed artwork, and cinematic ambitions helped it become one of the platform's defining early experiences. The game also revealed something important about the Amiga. People often remembered how it looked. That became a recurring theme throughout the machine's life. Developers were eager to take advantage of the hardware's visual capabilities, and players responded enthusiastically when they did. Other software highlighted different strengths. The Pawn, released by Magnetic Scrolls in 1986, became one of the most celebrated text adventures of the era. The game combined detailed writing with high-quality illustrations, demonstrating that the Amiga's appeal extended beyond arcade action and graphical showcases. Different audiences were discovering different reasons to buy the machine. Arcade conversions provided another showcase. Marble Madness arrived with presentation that compared favorably to many contemporary home computer conversions. The game demonstrated that the Amiga could handle fast-moving action while maintaining a level of polish that consumers increasingly expected. Outside gaming, users discovered entirely different reasons to purchase the machine. Artists embraced deluxe paint, which quickly became one of the most influential graphics packages of the era. The software allowed users to create artwork, animations, and game assets using tools that felt remarkably sophisticated for a home computer. Many of the graphics appearing in commercial games during the late 1980s and early 1990s were created using deluxe paint. The influence of the software extended far beyond the Amiga itself. Musicians were discovering new possibilities as well. In 1987, Karsten Obarski released Ultimate Sound Tracker, software that allowed users to arrange sampled sounds into musical compositions. The program helped establish techniques that would influence computer music for years to come. For some owners, the Amiga became less a machine for consuming media and more a machine for creating it.
What will you do with the Amiga computer? Thank you.
We have asked our resident Amiga artist, Jack Hager, to sit in with him.
Are you ready to paint me?
Yeah. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm here tonight to help assist Andy do his first computer portrait using the Amiga computer. First off, Andy is going to take a digital snapshot of Debbie, which is running on this system, and you can see the image up there on that screen. And we just select the image and it comes down. You found it to be very spontaneous, haven't you?
Yeah, it's great. It's such a great thing.
What more can you say?
Well,
I can
does
say
a lot of things.
Oh, that looks very good.
So now we'll do the hair. So we'll go up to color and pick yellow.
Andy is selecting.
As more software appeared, the platform's identity began taking shape. Publishers such as Psygnosis became closely associated with the machine. Founded by former employees of Liverpool-based Imagine Software, the company built a reputation for ambitious visual presentation. Psygnosis box art became instantly recognizable on shop shelves, while its games frequently appeared in demonstrations, magazine coverage, and advertising. The rivalry with the Atari ST added further energy. Both machines attracted passionate supporters. Magazine comparisons became common. Debates over graphics, sound, and software libraries filled letters pages and user group discussions. Consumers frequently found themselves choosing between two platforms that appeared to represent competing visions of the future. For Commodore, this competition was both exciting and dangerous. The company had acquired extraordinary technology. Now it needed to convert admiration into sustained commercial success. The Amiga had arrived. The next challenge was transforming a remarkable machine into a lasting platform. By the late 1980s, people increasingly bought Amigas for what they could do with them, rather than the specifications printed on the box. The machine had arrived with impressive demonstrations and ambitious promises, but by 1988, those promises were being tested by software. The question was no longer whether the Amiga possessed advanced hardware. The question was whether developers could turn that hardware into experiences that justified the excitement surrounding the platform. Many of them could. One reason the Amiga remains so strongly remembered is that the same period produced a remarkable variety of games. Action games, strategy games, adventures, simulations, role-playing games, and experimental projects all appeared on the machine. Different players often remember entirely different Amiga libraries because the platform rarely pushed users toward a single genre. Few examples became more famous than Shadow of the Beast. Released by Reflections in 1989 and published by Psygnosis, the game immediately attracted attention for its enormous sprites, atmospheric presentation, and multiple layers of parallax scrolling. Reviewers frequently used it as a benchmark when discussing graphics. Retailers often used it to demonstrate the machine to potential customers. The game became one of the Amiga's calling cards. Whether players admired the gameplay or found it frustrating, the presentation was difficult to ignore. Shadow of the Beast represented a broader trend. By the end of the 1980s, Amiga developers were increasingly confident that visual spectacle could become part of a game's identity rather than merely a technical feature. At the same time, other studios were experimenting with entirely new ideas. One of the most influential examples, Populous. Released by Bullfrog Productions in 1989, the game placed players in the role of a deity competing against a rival god. Rather than controlling individual characters, players reshaped terrain, influenced populations, and manipulated the world itself. The concept felt unlike almost anything else available at the time. Populous helped establish what later became known as the God game genre and demonstrated that Amiga software was no longer relying solely on technical showcases. Original ideas were becoming just as important as technical achievement. One example of how rapidly the platform had evolved could be seen in Buggy Boy. Originally released as an arcade game in 1985, Buggy Boy reached the Amiga in 1988, after appearing on several other home systems. The basic game remained the same. Players raced dune buggies through obstacle-filled courses while collecting bonuses and weaving through gates, yet the experience varied dramatically depending on which version a player owned. Someone who remembered Buggy Boy from a ZX Spectrum or Commodore 64 might recall a very different game from someone who played it on an Amiga. The underlying design remained familiar, but advances in graphics, color, and presentation changed how the game felt. The same title could leave entirely different memories, depending on the hardware sitting beneath the television. Action games evolved as well. The Turrican series became one of the platform's most celebrated successes. Combining exploration, shooting, and enormous levels, the game delivered a sense of scale that impressed players throughout Europe. The environments felt vast, hidden areas encouraged exploration. The presentation was accompanied by memorable music that became almost as famous as the games themselves. The series reflected growing confidence among developers. The hardware was no longer new. Studios increasingly understood how to push it. Some developers pursued style aggressively. The Bitmap brothers became one of the most recognizable names associated with the platform, and Speedball 2 Brutal Deluxe became one of their defining works. Released in 1990, the game imagined a violent futuristic sport played inside steel arenas. Matches moved quickly. The presentation felt sleek and distinctive, and the atmosphere combined sport, science fiction, and arcade action in a way that stood apart from more traditional sports simulations. The game became particularly popular in multiplayer sessions. Its combination of accessibility and competitiveness helped it remain a fixture on Amiga systems long after its release. Not every memorable game relied on intensity. Rainbow Islands arrived on the Amiga in 1990 and provided a very different experience. Colourful environments, cheerful music, and approachable gameplay gave it broad appeal. While many developers were chasing realism, darker themes, or technological spectacle, Rainbow Islands demonstrated that polished, imaginative entertainment still had a large audience. Role-playing games also found a home on the platform. Dungeon Master had already established itself as one of the most influential computer role-playing games of the era when it arrived on the Amiga in 1988. Instead of turn-based battles and abstract menus, players explored dungeons in real time. Monsters attacked without waiting politely for commands. Resources had to be managed under pressure. The result felt immediate and immersive. Many later dungeon crawlers borrowed ideas introduced by Dungeon Master. Its influence extended far beyond the Amiga itself. Eye of the Beholder continued that tradition in 1991. Based on Dungeons & Dragons, the game brought detailed fantasy environments and party-based exploration to the platform. Players mapped labyrinths, solved puzzles, and fought monsters while gradually developing their characters. The game demonstrated that the Amiga could comfortably support the sort of role-playing experiences often associated with dedicated computer systems. For players interested in fantasy rather than arcade action, the platform offered plenty of options. Black Crypt arrived in 1992. Developed by Raven Software, it became one of the most respected role-playing games created specifically for the Amiga. The game combined dungeon exploration, puzzle solving, and spell casting within a dark fantasy setting. For Raven Software, it marked the beginning of a career that would later include some of the most recognizable games in action gaming. For Amiga owners, it represented another example of developers continuing to invest seriously in the platform. Adventure games thrived as well. Monkey Island 2: LeChuck's Revenge reached the Amiga in 1992 and brought one of the era's most celebrated adventures to Commodore's machine. The game itself wasn't exclusive to the platform, but the Amiga version revealed both the strengths and limitations of contemporary hardware. Players gained access to the same humor, characters, and puzzles that made the game famous elsewhere. At the same time, fitting such an ambitious production onto floppy disks required considerable effort. The Amiga version shipped across numerous disks and often demanded frequent swapping as players progressed through the adventure. For many owners, however, the inconvenience was worthwhile. The opportunity to experience one of the industry's most acclaimed adventures on an Amiga remained a powerful selling point. By the beginning of the 90s, developers were becoming increasingly interested in cinematic presentation. Another World, created by Eric Chahi and released in 1991, became one of the clearest examples. The game used minimal dialogue, sparse interfaces, and striking visual design to tell its story. Animated sequences flowed naturally into gameplay. Players learned about the world through observation rather than lengthy explanations. The result felt distinctive then and remains distinctive today. Many later developers would pursue similar approaches, but Another World demonstrated how powerful visual storytelling could be when handled with restraint. Not every success depended on narrative. Lemmings arrived in 1991 and became one of the most successful games associated with the platform. Created by DMA Design, the game challenged players to guide streams of tiny creatures, lemmings, safely through increasingly complex levels. Each lemming marched relentlessly forward unless assigned a specific task. Players created routes, solved puzzles, and attempted to prevent disaster. The premise sounded ridiculous, not anymore. The execution proved brilliant. Lemmings appealed to experienced players while remaining approachable to newcomers, helping it reach audiences far beyond traditional computer gaming circles. As the platform matured, some developers concentrated on refining familiar ideas rather than reinventing them. Sensible Soccer, first released in '92, became one of the most enduring football games ever created. The controls were straightforward. Matches moved quickly. Success depended on skill rather than memorizing complex systems. Even as football games grew increasingly sophisticated, many players continued returning to Sensible Soccer because it remains enjoyable. Pinball Dreams arrived the same year. Created by Digital Illusions, the game transformed pinball into one of the Amiga's most impressive technical showcases. Smooth scrolling, detailed tables, and excellent audio helped it become one of the platform's defining experiences. The success of Pinball Dreams established a foundation that would later help Digital Illusions grow into a much larger company. By 1992, another side of Amiga culture had become impossible to ignore: the demo scene. Groups of programmers, artists, and musicians collaborated on productions designed to push hardware beyond its apparent limits. These demonstrations were not commercial games. They existed because participants wanted to discover what was possible. One famous example was State of the Art, released by Spaceballs in 1992. Using animated silhouettes, music, and visual effects, the production demonstrated that enthusiasts could create experiences every bit as memorable as commercial software. The demo scene revealed something unusual about the Amiga audience. Many owners weren't satisfied with simply playing games. They wanted to understand how those games worked, modify them, improve them, create something of their own. Amiga wasn't defined primarily by its hardware specifications, it was defined by the software people remembered years later. For some that meant Shadow of the Beast, for others Populous, Lemmings, Another World, Sensible Soccer, for others still it meant role-playing adventures, football games, pinball tables, or late-night demo competitions. The machine had become whatever its users wanted it to be: games machine, art workstation, music studio, role-playing platform, demo machine. Commodore believed the next technological shift would allow those worlds to converge even more. The company called that future Multimedia.
If you imagined having a home computer would be glum, you'll be glad to see the Commodore Amiga 500, which does arcade-quality games. You can compose a symphony, or you can plan a new garden. The Amiga 500 could make all the difference to a child's education. So don't imagine having a home computer would be glum, because happily you can buy a Commodore Amiga 500. For details, call 01-873-9800. You'll be glad you did.
By the beginning of the 1990s, many technology companies believed they knew where computing was headed. The answer seemed to be multimedia. Compact discs could store dramatically more information than floppy disks. Hardware manufacturers imagined products combining music, graphics, video, games, and educational software in ways that had previously been impractical. Industry magazines filled with predictions about interactive entertainment, digital encyclopedias, and living room devices that would transform how people consumed information. The excitement wasn't limited to Commodore. Across the technology industry, companies large and small attempted to position themselves for what many believed would be the next major shift in computing. Consumers were becoming familiar with compact discs through music. CD players were increasingly common in homes. The storage capacity offered obvious advantages over floppy disks, and businesses throughout the industry searched for ways to turn that capacity into new products. Commodore had good reason to pay attention. The Amiga already possessed many of the capabilities associated with this vision. Its graphics impressed users, its audio capabilities attracted musicians and developers. Creative software flourished on the platform. If multimedia represented the future, Commodore appeared unusually well positioned to benefit. The challenge was deciding what form that future would take. Commodore's answer arrived in 1991. The machine was called the CDTV. On a technical level, the system was closely related to the Amiga 500. Commodore packaged the hardware in a form designed to resemble consumer electronics rather than a traditional computer. Instead of sitting beside a monitor on a desk, it looked more at home alongside a television, stereo system, or video recorder. That presentation was, of course, deliberate. The CDTV shipped with a remote control. The casing resembled hi-fi equipment. Commodore wanted customers to see the machine as a living room device rather than a computer. The company hoped to attract people who might never consider purchasing a conventional PC, and in theory the idea possessed considerable appeal. Consumers could listen to music CDs, educational publishers could produce interactive reference works, developers could create software that combined images, sound, and large amounts of stored information. The machine appeared to fit neatly into many of the industry's predictions about the future. The problem was explaining exactly what the CDTV was. It wasn't quite a computer, it wasn't quite a games console, it wasn't quite a CD player. Potential customers often struggled to understand where it belonged. The software library reflected this uncertainty. Some releases focused on education, others emphasized multimedia experiences. Many were derived from existing Amiga software. SimCity appeared on the platform, allowing players to design and manage growing cities. Battle chess combined traditional chess with animated battles between pieces, demonstrating how additional storage capacity could be used to enhance presentation. The software itself was often impressive. The problem was differentiation. Consumers already familiar with the Amiga frequently wondered why they should purchase a CDTV instead. New customers often remained uncertain about what the machine actually offered that existing electronics didn't. The difficulties weren't unique to Commodore. Throughout the industry, companies were attempting to predict how consumers would use emerging technologies. Large sums of money flowed into multimedia projects. Publishers invested in interactive encyclopedias, educational titles, and experimental software. Marketing departments imagined households eagerly embracing entirely new forms of entertainment and information. Some of those predictions proved remarkably accurate. Digital audio became standard, CD-ROM drives became common, video became an everyday part of computing. Reference materials moved from bookshelves onto disks, and eventually onto the internet. The future that companies imagined largely arrived. The problem was that consumers often adopted those technologies in different ways than companies expected. And looking back, the CDTV feels less like a failure of technology and more like a snapshot of industry expectations at a particular moment in time. The machine reveals what companies believed consumers would want before the market had fully revealed its preferences. For Commodore, however, commercial realities mattered more than historical curiosity. Resources spent on unsuccessful products couldn't be spent elsewhere. Competition continued intensifying. The company still possessed respected technology and a loyal audience, but it needed stronger results than the CDTV provided. At the same time, Amiga developers continued producing major games for the machines people already owned. In 1993, Bullfrog released Syndicate. Set in a future where corporations had replaced governments, the game placed players in control of a company using cybernetically modified agents to seize territory, eliminate targets, and expand its power. It combined strategy, management, and action in a way that felt unusually cold and systematic. Players weren't cast as heroes. They were running an organization, Syndicate, that treated violence as a business expense. The game wasn't a CDTV showpiece. It was a reminder that ordinary Amiga software could still feel ambitious without relying on the multimedia promises surrounding compact discs. The same year, Sensible Software released Cannon Fodder. On the surface, it looked approachable. Tiny soldiers marched across bright landscapes, players guided them with simple mouse controls, and the game moved with the immediacy of an arcade title. Underneath that presentation was a much harsher idea. Soldiers died permanently. Graves appeared between missions. New recruits replaced the dead. The game treated war as chaotic, wasteful, and absurd. Its marketing drew attention before release. Promotional material used a poppy alongside the slogan, "War has never been so much fun." The Royal British Legion objected to the use of imagery associated with remembrance, and tabloid coverage attacked the game for combining war, humor, and commercial entertainment. Sensible Software and its supporters argued that the game was anti-war rather than a celebration of war, but the criticism forced changes to the packaging and helped push Cannon Fodder into public discussion beyond the usual games magazines. That response says a lot about the Amiga's position in '93. The machine was still receiving games that people argued about, remembered, and played obsessively. Commodore was trying to sell a multimedia future. Many Amiga owners were still buying games. Fortunately, one lesson had become increasingly clear. If consumers were interested in compact discs, games offered one of the most compelling reasons to adopt the format. Commodore would soon attempt a different approach. Rather than disguising a computer as a consumer electronics device, it would build a machine that embraced gaming directly. The result would become the CD32, and it would represent one of the company's final attempts to change its fortunes. Commodore occupied a kind of strange position within the computer industry in the early 1990s. The company still possessed respected technology. The Amiga remained capable hardware. Developers continued producing games, creative software, and professional applications. Millions of Commodore machines remained in use across Europe and elsewhere around the world. Yet, Commodore no longer occupied the position it had enjoyed during the Commodore 64 era. In the early 1980s, the company had helped define home computing, but by 1993 it was one competitor among many. The market looked very different from the one Commodore had conquered a decade earlier. Nintendo had built a huge audience through the NES and Super Nintendo. Sega's Mega Drive had become particularly successful across Europe. Personal computers were becoming increasingly attractive gaming machines as VGA graphics cards, Sound Blaster audio, and rapidly improving processors narrowed the gap between dedicated computers and consoles. Consumers interested in games had more options than ever before. That created a problem for Commodore. The company's greatest successes had often come from offering something distinctive at the right moment. The VIC-20 introduced many households to computing. The Commodore 64 delivered a combination of price, software, and accessibility that competitors struggled to match. The Amiga impressed users with graphics and sounds that felt years ahead of many rivals.
They take everything very seriously. And they take business like war, and I believe that very much because I could see that's the only way to win.
Industry experts also point to other factors in Commodore's present success. Commodore beats the opposition at the marketing game. It produced a low-cost home computer capable of doing more than playing games, and it has been able to meet or beat the competition on price.
And here is where we make money or lose money.
The main reason Commodore can beat the others in price competition is that it designs and makes its own computer chips, the tiny pieces of silicon that are the key to the technology. That means that the company controls a vital cost and does not have to depend on outside suppliers. These prototype chips are being designed at a Commodore plant outside Philadelphia, but most manufacturing is done in Asia. Some other companies also make their own chips, but they don't have a Jack Tramiel pushing the buttons. Tramiel believes his company has to be where the action is.
By the early 1990s, those advantages no longer stood alone. Competitors had improved, the market had matured, and being impressive was no longer enough. The company's financial position reflected that reality.
Standard. Mario. You'll find the superset is like no other system. In performance, handling, and Mode 7 control, you'll get Super Mario World. And for $4.50 and posted, Super Mario All-Stars free with 4 Mario games in one.
For the fiscal year ending in June 1993, Commodore reported revenue of approximately $590 million and a net loss of more than $356 million. The company still generated substantial sales, but losses were arriving faster than profits. Years of inconsistent management, missed opportunities, and unsuccessful products had weakened the business. The CDTV had done little to improve the situation. The machine reflected the industry's enthusiasm for multimedia, but it failed to establish a clear identity with consumers. Commodore had invested resources in a product that never achieved the success it needed. The company required something simpler, something easier to explain. Its answer arrived in 1993. The machine was called the CD32. Unlike the CDTV, Commodore made little effort to disguise what this product was supposed to be. The CD32 was a games console.
I never found out why he chose me to share his secret. Perhaps because we had similar dreams. But this was twice as fast. Twice as powerful as anything I'd ever thought possible. Though what that meant, I could never have foreseen. Incredible graphics. And colors. So many colors. Our world would never be the same again.
It used technology derived from the Amiga platform, but its purpose was immediately obvious. Consumers understood games consoles, they understood controllers, they understood compact discs. After years of uncertainty about multimedia devices, Commodore was finally selling a machine that people could identify at a glance. The hardware offered several advantages. Developers understood the underlying architecture. Existing Amiga software provided a starting point for future releases. Publishers didn't need to learn an entirely new system from scratch. Commodore could build upon more than a decade of experience. The software reflected those strengths. Titles such as the Chaos Engine, Alien Breed, and Super Stardust demonstrated the quality that Amiga developers could achieve. The Chaos Engine combined cooperative action with detailed steampunk-inspired environments. Alien Breed expanded Team 17's growing reputation for accessible science fiction action. Super Stardust delivered visual effects that made effective use of the hardware. Other releases demonstrated the possibilities of compact discs. Simon the Sorcerer's CD used extensive voice acting, including that of Chris Barry, that would have been difficult to accommodate on floppy disks. Beneath a Steel Sky offered spoken dialogue and one of the strongest adventure game experiences available on the platform. Guardian became a technical showcase combining fast movement, three-dimensional action with a sense of speed that impressed reviewers and players alike. Microcosm represented another side of the CD-ROM era, built around pre-rendered visuals and full-motion video sequences. The game attempted to demonstrate the sort of experiences that larger storage capacities could make possible. Like many products of the period, it reflected an industry fascinated by what compact discs might become. For a brief period, Commodore appeared to have found the right formula. The CD32 performed well in several European markets and became the best-selling CD-ROM console in the United Kingdom during the 1993 Christmas season. After the confusion surrounding the CDTV, the company finally possessed a product with genuine momentum. The problem was timing. Commodore needed success immediately. The business no longer had years available to recover from mistakes. A successful console launch wasn't enough on its own. The company needed revenue. It needed stability, access to major markets. That last requirement soon became a serious problem. The dispute that followed had little to do with games. It centered on a graphics patent associated with a company called CAD-Track. The patent described a method of manipulating graphics on a display using an operation known as XOR, or exclusive OR. The technique allowed objects such as cursors, highlighted areas, and other graphical elements to be drawn and removed without permanently altering the image underneath. By the early 1990s, such techniques were familiar throughout computing. That made the dispute feel kind of strangely mundane. Amiga users argued about whether Commodore systems even used the patented method in the way CAD-Track claimed. The legal details mattered less than the outcome. CAD-Track pursued royalties. Commodore failed to resolve the dispute. A federal injunction prevented the company from importing products into the United States. For Commodore, the consequences were severe. The company had prepared inventory for an American CD32 launch. Reports from the period suggested that large quantities of hardware remained in Commodore's manufacturing facilities in the Philippines while the dispute continued. The machines existed, retail opportunities existed, and the Christmas shopping season existed. The consoles simply couldn't reach American customers. The injunction didn't create Commodore's financial difficulties. Those difficulties had been building for years. What it removed was one of the company's best opportunities to improve them. While Commodore fought legal battles, Sega continued selling Mega Drives, Nintendo continued selling their consoles, PC manufacturers continued selling computers. One of the most important markets in the world remained largely inaccessible to Commodore at precisely the moment the company could least afford the setback. By March 1994, Commodore's own financial reports warned that without additional resources, the company could face reorganization or liquidation. That wasn't the language of a business waiting for one successful Christmas season. It was the language of a company running out of time. The CD32 had shown that Commodore could still build attractive hardware. It had shown that developers could still produce compelling software. It had shown there was still interest in the Amiga platform. None of that proved sufficient. In April 1994, Commodore filed for bankruptcy. The announcement marked the end of a company that had spent decades moving through successive technological eras. Typewriters, calculators, personal computers, creative workstations, multimedia systems, games consoles. Each stage had reshaped the business. Now, the business itself had reached the end. For many users, however, the news felt strangely disconnected from everyday experience. Their computers still worked, games still worked, Amiga magazines were still being published, developers still released software, millions of Commodore machines remained in homes around the world. Commodore had disappeared as a company. Its products hadn't disappeared with it. The bankruptcy marked the end of the business. It didn't mark the end of the machines. After Commodore's bankruptcy, something pretty unusual happened. The company's products continued evolving without the company itself. Amiga users upgraded machines, expanded hardware, exchanged software, and maintained systems long after many observers expected interest to disappear. New operating system projects emerged. Hardware enthusiasts designed accelerators, storage devices, and replacement components. Developers continued supporting classic systems years after Commodore itself had vanished. The Commodore 64 followed a similar path. Programmers continued writing software, musicians composing SID music, they continued. Collectors restored aging hardware. Enthusiasts designed new cartridges, interfaces, and peripherals for machines that had already spent more than a decade on the market. Many technology products disappeared quickly after their manufacturers stopped supporting them, but Commodore's machines didn't, and part of the reason could be found in the communities that had formed around them. Unlike many consumer electronics products, Commodore systems encouraged participation. People learned programming on them. They created artwork, they composed music, they modified hardware, they exchanged software and technical knowledge. Ownership often became involvement. When Commodore disappeared, those communities remained. The demo scene became one of the clearest examples. Before Commodore's bankruptcy, demo groups had already spent years pushing Amiga and Commodore hardware beyond its apparent limits. After 1994, that challenge became even more appealing to some. The hardware was aging, but programmers, artists, and musicians continued discovering new techniques and producing increasingly ambitious demonstrations. In some cases, developers were still finding capabilities hidden inside hardware that had originally been designed during the Cold War. The software survived as well. Thousands of games, applications, and utilities might easily have vanished as disks deteriorated and hardware failed. Instead, enthusiasts preserved them. Collections were archived, documentation was scanned, technical information was shared. Programs that once existed only on aging floppy disks became available to future generations. Emulation accelerated that process dramatically. Vice allowed Commodore 64 software to run on modern computers. Amiga emulators made it possible to revisit systems that had become increasingly difficult to maintain. Players no longer needed original hardware to experience many of the games within Commodore's games catalog. They could explore Elite's vast galaxy of trading, combat and exploration, the acrobatic infiltration of Impossible Mission, the robot hijacking battles of Paradroid, the high-speed assaults of Iridium, the martial arts duels of International Karate Plus, the cinematic world of The Last Ninja, the swashbuckling adventures of pirates, the world-shaping strategy of Populous, the puzzle-solving chaos of Lemmings, the fast-paced matches of Sensible Soccer, and countless other titles decades after their original release. This created an unusual situation. Some people experienced Commodore software for the first time long after Commodore's original business had collapsed. People continued discovering Commodore software even though no new Commodore computers were being produced. Preservation was only part of the story. New software kept appearing. Modern Commodore 64 games such as Sam's Journey showed that developers were still willing to build ambitious commercial releases for the machine decades after its original market had vanished. New Amiga games also continued to appear, often created by small teams, hobbyist developers, and independent publishers working for audiences that mainstream companies had long since abandoned. People weren't simply remembering Commodore, they were still making things for it. Evidence of that activity eventually appeared in an unexpected place: retail shops. In 2018, Retro Games Limited released the C64 Mini, a compact recreation of Commodore's most famous computer. The machine arrived preloaded with 64 games, including titles such as California Games, Paradroid, and Iridium. A full-sized version, known simply as the C64, followed in 2019, and unlike the Mini, it included a working keyboard, making it feel closer to a usable computer rather than only a plug-in nostalgia device. The significance of these products wasn't technological. Modern phones and laptops were vastly more powerful than the original Commodore 64. The significance was commercial. More than 20 years after Commodore's bankruptcy, companies still believed there was an audience willing to buy new Commodore-themed hardware and revisit software from the 1980s. The pattern continued with the Amiga. In 2022, the A500 Mini offered a compact reimagining of the Amiga 500, bundled with games such as Alien Breed, Another World, The Chaos Engine, and Worms. Once again, old software was being packaged for new audiences in modern hardware. The continued popularity of retro gaming strengthened that interest further. Games that once competed for review scores and Christmas sales became historical artifacts. Hardware, once considered cutting edge, became museum material. People who grew up with Commodore systems increasingly found themselves explaining those machines to younger generations, yet Commodore culture never became entirely retrospective. Players still argue about the best Commodore 64 games, musicians still create SID compositions, programmers still produce demos, collectors still restore hardware, developers still release new software.
The Commodore 64 Family Pack is the best way I know to introduce your family to the world of the future. The Commodore 64 is the world's largest selling computer with more than 7 million units purchased worldwide and the world's largest software base for education and entertainment. With this superb Australian reference book included, all for $399 at Commodore dealers now.
Are you keeping up with the Commodore? 'Cause the Commodore is keeping up with you.
Even Amiga OS continued receiving updates for classic machines decades after Commodore disappeared, a reminder that the platform's history didn't freeze in 1994. Commodore disappeared as a business, its machines continued taking on lives of their own. The company built computers, people turned them into games machines, music studios, art workstations, programming tools and creative playgrounds. That process didn't end when Commodore disappeared, but decades later, people are still writing software, composing music, creating demos, and discovering these machines for the first time. For a company that filed for bankruptcy in 1994, that's a remarkable legacy. Thanks for watching the vid, I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please consider liking and subscribing to help me out and so we can stay in touch. Have a great rest of your day, have a great sleep, have a great whatever you're up to. Bye for now.
Stay